In 67 CE, a Chinese emperor woke from a dream drenched in sweat. He'd seen a golden figure, 16 feet tall, hovering above his palace. Light radiated from its body, but the figure's face, serene, still, like carved stone. Emperor Ming of the Han Dynasty called his advisors at dawn. What does this mean? An old scholar consulted texts from the Western Kingdom. This is the Buddha, a sage who conquered death itself. What happened next should have been philosophically awkward. Buddhism arrived teaching suffering, karma, rebirth, disciplined effort toward enlightenment. China already had Taoism, a philosophy that said the highest wisdom is non-forcing, that pushing the river creates the problem, that nature already knows the way. These seemed hard to reconcile. For the first 400 years they were, and then something shifted. These two philosophies didn't destroy each other, they began synthesizing and created the version of Buddhism that spread across East Asia. Chan, later called Zen. This is the story of one of the most influential fusions in religious history, and it reveals something that took centuries to fully understand. China didn't dilute Buddhism. China revealed what Buddhism had been reaching for all along. Buddhism arrived in China expecting comprehension. What it got was 400 years of confused silence. And here's what complicates the story. China didn't choose one philosophy and reject the others. China held Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism together, the three teachings. People lived a blend. Scholar, in the morning following Confucian propriety. Hermit, in the afternoon practicing Taoist meditation. Buddhist at death preparing for rebirth. This wasn't confusion, this was Chinese culture. When Buddhism arrived, it entered a crowded marketplace of ideas, and the story starts with a translation crisis nobody could solve. When Buddhist scriptures first arrived in China, scholars tried to read them and couldn't. Not because of the language, because of the logic. Recorded in later Chinese histories, Emperor Ming sent envoys west in 67 CE. They returned with Buddhist monks and texts. By the 2nd century, translators like An Shigao began the work. The monks translated. The Chinese scholars read. Immediately questions. The texts spoke of karma, moral causation across lifetimes. China had rich afterlife traditions, ancestor veneration, heavenly bureaucracy. But Buddhist rebirth logic, karma across many lives aimed at liberation from the entire cycle, felt like a different operating system. The texts spoke of nirvana, extinguishing craving, ending suffering. But Taoism distrusted forced striving more than it distrusted life itself. The problem to Taoists wasn't desire. It was forcing desire against nature's flow. The text spoke of dharma, cosmic law, Buddha's teaching, the nature of reality. Early translators used the word Tao, but that created immediate confusion. So Buddha is just teaching the Tao? Then why do we need India to tell us what Lao Tzu already said? By the 3rd century, a movement emerged, Gu-Yi Buddhism, concept matching. Take Buddhist ideas, match them to existing Chinese philosophical vocabulary, make it comprehensible. Nirvana became wu-wei, non-forcing. Śūnyatā, emptiness, became wu, nothingness, the void. Buddha became another sage who grasped the Tao. The Prajnaparamita text spoke of śūnyatā, emptiness of inherent existence. Nothing exists on its own. The Guyi translators used Wu, but Wu in Taoist texts means the primordial void from which things arise. Close, but not the same. One deconstructs existence, the other generates it. This wasn't just semantic, it was philosophical. Buddhist monks arriving from India saw this and reacted. No, you're misunderstanding everything. The Buddha didn't teach the Tao. Emptiness isn't nothingness. Nirvana isn't wu-wei. These are superficial matches. You're missing the entire framework. And the problem, they were partially right. Guyi wasn't stupidity, it was the first bridge, it just couldn't carry the full weight. The translations were confusing more than convincing. Buddhism was stalling among the educated elite. Chinese literati began dismissing it as barbarian superstition, perhaps useful for the masses seeking comfort, not for serious philosophical minds. By the 4th century, Buddhism risked remaining a foreign cult rather than a living philosophy. It needed a translator who understood both worlds completely, someone who could think in Sanskrit and feel in Chinese, someone who knew when literal accuracy mattered and when it obscured the truth. It needed someone who'd lost everything. Buddhism was failing to persuade the literati. The text made no sense. The concepts felt alien. And then a prisoner, a man who'd spent 17 years in captivity, realized something. The only way to save Buddhism was to violate the literalist ideal, to change the words, to commit what conservative monks would call heresy. And he did it anyway. His name was Kumārajīva, born in 344 CE in Kucha, a Silk Road city-state where cultures collided. His father was an Indian Buddhist monk. His mother, a princess from Kucha who became a nun. He grew up speaking Sanskrit and Chinese, understanding both philosophical worlds. By age 7, he'd memorized major Mahayana sutras. By his teens, he'd mastered Buddhist philosophy. He became famous across Central Asia as a brilliant teacher. And then, he was captured. A Chinese general named Lu Guang invaded Kucha in 383 CE, took Kumārajīva prisoner, held him for 17 years. 17 years. Ripped from his home, his language, his work, everything he knew. But those 17 years forced him into the Chinese mind more deeply than any voluntary study could have. Not just vocabulary, how Chinese people think, what concepts they already possess, what they're missing, where Indian logic lands and where it slides off. In 401 CE, he was released, brought to Chang'an, the Chinese capital, given imperial sponsorship, a team of assistants. The task: translate the Buddhist canon into Chinese. And this is where Kumārajīva made his choice. Earlier translators had leaned heavily on Taoist vocabulary, Wu and Wu-wei as approximations for Buddhist concepts. Kumārajīva helped standardize new terminology without erasing the older vocabulary entirely. He rebuilt the house. For śūnyatā, emptiness, he standardized the character Kong as the main philosophical workhorse, not Wu, nothingness. Kong carries the sense of openness, spaciousness, lack of obstruction, closer to the Buddhist meaning, interdependent arising, lack of inherent existence, while still resonating with Taoist sensibilities about openness and flow. For nirvana, he used nibbana, a transliteration that preserved the Sanskrit, while embedding it in descriptions that Chinese minds could grasp: the extinguishing of craving, the natural state beyond forcing. His translations of texts like the Lotus Sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, these shaped how East Asia would understand Mahayana Buddhism for the next 15 centuries. Conservative monks from India were furious. You're making Buddha sound Taoist, you're changing the meaning. Kumārajīva's response, recorded in Sengyu's biographical account. Translation is like chewing rice and feeding it to another. The flavor is already altered. He knew he was changing something, but he also knew literal translation without comprehension changes nothing. It just preserves incomprehension in a different language. Think about Creole languages. When French met West African languages in Haiti, linguists initially dismissed Haitian Creole as broken French. But it wasn't broken. It was evolved. New grammar, new structure, fully functional. Different, not deficient. Kumārajīva was creating a Buddhist Creole, Chinese Buddhism, not Indian Buddhism translated, but Buddhism reborn in Chinese soil. When Chinese readers encountered Kumārajīva's versions, they didn't say this is foreign wisdom. They said, we understand this. The story goes, on his deathbed, Kumārajīva made a prediction. He said, if my translations are true to the Dharma, when my body is cremated, my tongue will not burn. Later accounts claim when they cremated him, his entire body turned to ash, except his tongue. The Chinese took this as proof he hadn't corrupted Buddhism. He'd found the right words. But was it just Kumārajīva's skill as a translator, or was something deeper happening? Something neither Buddhism nor Taoism had fully articulated alone. The answer wasn't in the palace translation hall. It was in the mountains. The answer wasn't in the palace translation hall, it was in the mountains, in how Chinese minds already practiced stillness. Deep in the Zhongnan Mountain, a Taoist monk in the 5th century is reading a newly translated Prajnaparamita text. He reaches the line, later condensed into the Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. He stops, reads it again. Then he reaches for his copy of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. He's reading something parallel, different words, similar insight. This wasn't one monk, this was happening across China's sacred peaks. Wutai, Yimei, Putuo. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Buddhism was spreading to monasteries built on Taoist sacred sites. Monks from both traditions living together, sharing practices, debating philosophy late into the night. And slowly, the realization emerged. They weren't identical doctrines, but they were addressing similar questions from different starting points. Notice what happens when you place them side by side. Taoism teaches the Tao is ineffable. Ultimate reality cannot be captured in language. The Tao Te Ching. Chapter 1. The name you give it isn't it. Buddhism teaches śūnyatā, emptiness, is beyond all conceptual elaboration. Nagarjuna shows that the mind's concepts collapse when you try to pin reality down. They weren't identical doctrines. Emptiness deconstructs inherent existence. The Tao describes a generative flow, but both undermine rigid conceptual control. Both say, stop trying to pin reality down with words. Taoism teaches wu-wei, non-forcing. The Tao Te Ching, Chapter 8. The highest good is like water. Water benefits all things without contention. Buddhism teaches non-grasping, non-attachment. The second noble truth, tanha, craving, causes suffering. Clinging to what changes creates pain. Let go. Same principle, different emphasis. One says stop forcing, the other says stop clinging. Taoism teaches Zuran, self-so, spontaneous nature. The Tao Te Ching says, the Tao abides in non-action, yet nothing is left undone. Buddhism teaches tathata, suchness, thusness, reality as it is. The Avatamsaka Sutra speaks of seeing things in their suchness, without adding or subtracting, and both traditions used paradox to teach. Taoism, those who know do not speak, those who speak do not know. These aren't riddles. They're designed to exhaust the mind's need to control reality with concepts. Buddhism developed short Chan case dialogues, sharp exchanges designed to corner the mind until it drops its grip on concepts. Like Taoist paradox, the point wasn't to provide answers. It was to exhaust the need for them so direct insight could emerge. And in those mountains, practices started merging. Taoist meditation already included breath awareness, sitting in stillness. Zhuangzi's Zhuo Wang, sitting and forgetting, points toward the same move, loosening the mind's grip on its own story. Buddhist meditation taught anapanasati, breath mindfulness, sati, clear awareness, samadhi, concentration, systematic observation. When Taoist hermits practiced Buddhist techniques, they found them surprisingly intuitive. The Taoist approach, don't fight thoughts. The Buddhist approach, observe them clearly. Together, a new emphasis emerged. Zuo-chan sitting meditation. Later, the Japanese would call it zazen. Sitting without trying to achieve anything, sitting without elaborate visualization or ritual complexity, sitting as the practice itself. Practices merged naturally because the philosophies were already compatible. And this created the foundation for what would become Chan Buddhism. But the fusion went beyond meditation halls. The Chinese had gods, an entire heavenly bureaucracy, and Buddhism was about to meet the Jade Emperor's court. Chinese cosmology had a bureaucracy problem. The Jade Emperor sits atop heaven's bureaucracy in popular imagination. Ministers, departments, ranks. Even the gods have assignments, duties, hierarchies. Buddhist cosmology taught 31 realms of existence, 6 realms of rebirth, hells, hungry ghosts, animals, humans, demigods, gods. Above those, higher meditative realms, and beyond all of that, nirvana. Escape from the entire system. The gods in Buddhism, the Deva, aren't creators. They're beings who earned pleasant rebirths through good karma. Powerful, yes. Long-lived, yes. But still trapped in samsara. Still subject to death and eventual rebirth. So, the question. The Jade Emperor rules heaven. Buddha sits beyond all heavens, having transcended the entire cycle. Who's in charge? In India, this wasn't complicated. Buddhism rejected Vedic deities as still trapped in rebirth. The gods might be powerful, might live for eons, but they're not enlightened. Buddha transcended them. In China, this was very complicated. The Jade Emperor wasn't foreign mythology, he was culturally central. Part of how Chinese people understood cosmic order. Removing him or demoting him meant erasing Chinese religious identity. So Chinese Buddhism did something brilliant. They didn't replace, they integrated. The solution: make them compatible, not competitive. It's like a layered map. One layer shows government and borders, political boundaries. Another layer shows mountains and rivers, topography. Both describe the same world. Different domains, both real. The Jade Emperor governs the heavenly bureaucracy, cosmic administration, maintains order across the realms and popular religion. Buddha exists outside the system, spiritual liberation, enlightenment, the way out of the cycle entirely. Both can be true simultaneously, and once that framework was established, something fascinating happened. The deities started transforming. Avalokiteshvara, the Indian bodhisattva of compassion, male figure in traditional iconography, 1,000 arms, eyes in every palm to see all suffering. He arrived in China as a male deity. Early Chinese art depicts him with distinctly masculine features. Over centuries, Avalokiteshvara gradually transformed into Guanyin, a woman, the most popular female deity in Chinese history. More temples dedicated to her than any other figure. Sailors prayed to her before voyages. Mothers prayed to her during childbirth. Farmers prayed to her for rain. She became the embodiment of mercy itself. The Chinese didn't just translate a deity, they transformed gender itself. Why? Because compassion to Chinese culture couldn't be fully expressed through masculine imagery alone. It needed to be maternal, unconditional, the way a mother loves a child who's done nothing to deserve it. Yin energy, receptive, nurturing. This wasn't a trivia makeover. It changed how ordinary people related to compassion, hope, and mercy in their daily lives. And here's what's striking. This wasn't controversial. Nobody said, "Wait, you changed the gender of a bodhisattva. That's heresy." People said, "Yes, this makes sense. This is how compassion feels." Yama, the Indian Buddhist Lord of Death and Judgment, became Yunluo Wang in China, king of the underworld. The Chinese added 10 courts of hell, bureaucratic afterlife judgment, each court handling specific karmic debts. Very organized, very Confucian. Maitreya, the future Buddha, depicted as a serious teaching figure in Indian Buddhism, became Buddhai in China. The laughing Buddha, fat, jolly, carrying a cloth sack of gifts, based on a monk remembered in later tradition. Why? Because Chinese culture valued contentment and abundance. Buddhai symbolized spiritual wealth expressed as generous joy. The 16th century novel Journey to the West, written by Wu Cheng'en, codified all of this. There's a scene where the Monkey King challenges the Jade Emperor's authority. The celestial generals can't stop him. Buddha arrives and makes a bet. Leap off my palm, win the throne. The Monkey King tries, travels to what he thinks is the edge of the universe, only to discover he never left Buddha's hand. The 5 pillars he found, Buddha's fingers. Chinese audiences hearing this story, in print, in opera, and folk performance, understood immediately. The Jade Emperor governs, Buddha transcends, both real. By the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, full synthesis in daily life. Many Chinese people didn't see contradictions. They prayed to Guanyin for mercy. They honored ancestors following Confucian tradition. They meditated in Chan monasteries. They told stories about the Jade Emperor and Buddha meeting in celestial realms. The boundaries blurred in lived experience. We covered in our 3 Schools of Buddhism video how Mahayana evolved beyond Theravada's focus on individual liberation toward universal compassion and bodhisattva ideals. But Chan, Zen, is Mahayana refracted through Chinese philosophical sensibilities. The compassion, the cosmic scope, the bodhisattva path, all Mahayana, but filtered through Taoist non-forcing, through Chinese cosmology, through centuries of cultural synthesis. But the fusion went deeper still. It changed Buddhism's core teaching about enlightenment itself. By 520 CE, something unprecedented happened. A Buddhist master from India, Bodhidharma, arrived in China. Legend says Emperor Wu of Liang invited him. The emperor had built countless temples, sponsored thousands of monks, funded Buddhist institutions across his empire. He asked Bodhidharma, "I've done all this for Buddhism. What merit have I earned?" Bodhidharma replied, "None whatsoever." Why? Because the emperor was still grasping, still trying to earn enlightenment through accumulation, still treating awakening like a transaction. Do good deeds, receive spiritual rewards. Bodhidharma recognized immediately, by the time he arrived, the soil had already changed. Chan Buddhism wasn't something he brought to China, it was something China had already started growing. Bodhidharma didn't plant the seed, he witnessed the tree. We covered Bodhidharma's legend in our Bodhidharma, the legend behind Zen and Kung Fu video. The 9 years meditating facing a wall, the supposed founding of Shaolin. But that video didn't tell you this. Bodhidharma arrived in a China that had already begun asking a different question. The 7th century, a monastery in southern China. The 5th Chan patriarch Hongren had a problem. He was dying. He needed to choose a successor to lead the Chan lineage. But he couldn't simply announce it. The monks would fight over the position. Jealousy, politics, ego. So he proposed a test. Write a poem demonstrating your understanding of Chan, display it publicly. The poem that shows true realization, that person becomes the 6th patriarch. Shengxiu, the head monk, most senior student, everyone's expected choice, wrote his verse on the monastery wall at midnight. The body is the Bodhi tree, the mind is like a bright mirror stand. At all times we must strive to polish it, and must not let dust collect. The monks read it at dawn. Brilliant, they said. Obviously, Shengxiu will be the next patriarch. Gradual cultivation. Polish the mirror of your mind. Remove dust constantly. Lifelong effort. Noble. Systematic. Then a kitchen worker, a man who couldn't read or write, asked someone to write his response next to Shengxiu's. His name was Huineng, an illiterate peasant. He chopped wood, hulled rice in the monastery kitchen. His poem. Bodhi originally has no tree. The bright mirror also has no stand. Fundamentally, there is not a single thing. Where could dust arise? The monastery erupted. How dare an illiterate peasant challenge our head monk? But the 5th patriarch read both poems carefully. That night he secretly called Huineng to his quarters, ordained him, gave him the robe and bowl, symbols of the patriarchate. Then he told him, "Leave immediately, tonight, don't tell anyone. The other monks will try to kill you." Huineng fled south into the darkness. He walked carrying nothing but a robe, a bowl, and the realization that would reshape East Asian Buddhism. He hid for 15 years, only revealed himself as the 6th patriarch when it was safe. Why did the 5th patriarch choose him? Shengxiu's poem was good. It described genuine practice, discipline, effort, constant cultivation. And to be clear, that path never disappeared. In Theravada traditions and in many Mahayana schools, gradual cultivation remains central. Chan didn't replace it. It reframed the starting point, but it assumed separation. I must polish my mind, subject and object, the polisher and the thing being polished. Huineng's poem cut deeper. If you're polishing your mind, you're treating awareness as an object separate from you. But you, the awareness doing the polishing, what's that? Who's polishing? And if awareness itself is already clear, already luminous, what dust could actually stick to it? This is the question Taoist-influenced Chan had been circling. Much of Indian Buddhism asked, how do I achieve enlightenment? Chan asked, what if enlightenment isn't something to achieve? What if the problem is, I'm looking for it somewhere else? Mahayana Buddhism already taught Buddha nature, the Tathagata Garbha doctrine. All beings possess the seed of enlightenment. The Lotus Sutra teaches, all beings will eventually become Buddhas. The capacity is inherent. But Taoist thinking pushed this further. If Buddha nature is already there, why are you searching outside yourself? The Tao Te Ching says the Tao is closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. Chan monasteries developed their own rhythm after this. Wake at 4 a.m. Sit in meditation for hours. Not elaborate visualization or ritual complexity. Just sitting, then work. Physical labor, chopping wood, hauling water, cooking, cleaning. The Japanese monk Dogen later summarized this. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. The practice isn't separate from life. Life is the practice. Chan doesn't deny training. It denies the fantasy that awakening is a thing you can possess. Famous Chan examples started appearing. A monk asks, what is Buddha? The master replies, 3 pounds of flax. Stop making Buddha into something distant or sacred or metaphysical. Reality is right here. This, now. 3 pounds of flax. Chan isn't rejecting doctrine, it's refusing abstraction. If you turn awakening into an object, you've already stepped away from it. Another monk asked, what is the meaning of Bodhidharma coming from the west? The master replied, the cypress tree in the courtyard. The tree is already showing you everything, suchness. Stop looking for meaning behind what's here. What's here is the meaning. What emerged in China was something neither tradition had articulated so clearly alone. Buddhism in India dismantled illusion. Taoism in China distrusted force. When they met, awakening stopped being something to achieve and became something to stop resisting. China revealed what Buddhism had been reaching for all along. Buddhism spread across China without an army, without forced conversion, without erasing Chinese culture, without declaring Taoism false or Confucianism inferior. It adapted while staying true to its core, and in adapting, it became more itself. Buddhism arrived with questions, not just answers, dialogue, not conquest. Chinese culture wasn't replaced, it was engaged for centuries, through translation struggles, through debates in mountain monasteries, through ordinary people trying to reconcile ancestral wisdom with foreign teachings. Both sides transformed. Buddhism became Chan, absorbed Taoist non-forcing, developed sudden enlightenment emphasis, created sitting without elaborate ritual. Taoism absorbed Buddhist ethics, meditation structures, cosmological frameworks, karmic understanding. The Taoist hermits didn't abandon the Tao to become Buddhist. The Buddhist monks didn't abandon the Dharma to become Taoist. They each discovered the other had been circling the same mountain from a different path, and when they met at the summit, they saw there was never one path. There were always many, all leading to the same peak. You might wonder, Buddhism spread to Tibet, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia. Why did China create this unique synthesis? China uniquely had an ancient, highly developed philosophical tradition. Taoism, already aimed at ineffability, non-forcing, and naturalness, a close conceptual neighbor for Mahayana ideas. Other regions adapted Buddhism too, but the neighbor was different. Tibet had Bon, Japan had Shinto. Each synthesis was unique. China's was shaped by the Taoist foundation. The teaching of inherent Buddha nature was already there in Mahayana texts. The Tathagata Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra. All teaching enlightenment isn't something you lack. It's your inherent nature. The possibility of sudden awakening was already there in the Buddha's own story. One night, complete realization. The emphasis on direct experience over concepts was already there in early Buddhist meditation. But it took Taoist philosophy, with its embrace of paradox, its rejection of forcing, its trust in what's already natural, to bring these elements into focus, to make them central. When Buddhism and Taoism met, neither asked which one is true. They asked, what are we both seeing? That shift from competition to recognition might be the deeper lesson. Today, the Jade Emperor still governs heaven in Chinese folk religion. Buddha still sits in meditation beyond all heavens. Guanyin still grants mercy. Taoist hermits still live on Buddhist sacred mountains. They didn't solve the contradiction by eliminating it. They solved it by living it. And that might be the most Buddhist thing of all. Letting go of Buddhism to find the Buddha that was never separate to begin with. If you want to see what happened when Buddhism met Western philosophy, another synthesis nobody expected, check out our Young versus Buddha, the Self versus No Self video. And if sudden enlightenment versus gradual cultivation intrigued you, our What is Zen Buddhism video goes deeper. Leave a comment. When two worldviews meet, do you think synthesis is possible? Or does something always get lost? Stay curious. Stay wise.